So I'm going to speak this afternoon on Homer, on being human. First, just to sort of begin, when I say Homer, who do I really mean? Those of you who've read some Homer will have thought about this question. But Homer is the name we use for the poet who is associated with these two great epic poems, these two great stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These grow out of what's called an oral tradition, so people kind of telling poems, telling stories through poems, that emerges over kind of hundreds of years, and then they reach this this point where they begin to become fixed, and the name that's attached to the poems is Homer. So some people are happy to say, you know, Homer is a poet. He composed the Iliad. He composed the Odyssey. Some people say, well, actually, we don't really know who composed these poems. Maybe they were kind of composed by committee, and we just put the name Homer on. I think they were each composed by a person. Whether or not they were composed by the same person, again, big questions. But when I'm saying Homer, I mean the person who wrote these two poems, or, you know, even if you don't think they were written by the same person, the person who composed this poem and the person who composed this poem. And what it is to be human is a key question in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad, which is this great narrative where Achilles, who's the son of Thetis, a goddess, and Peleus, a sort of mortal human being, is among the Greeks who are fighting for Troy. The Iliad takes place over really just a matter of days, and it covers this episode during the war, where there's a kind of argument over who gets which sex slave. It's incredibly bleak. And Agamemnon, who's the chief of the Greek army, says to Achilles, actually, I want your one. And Achilles says, well, no, she's my one. And Agamemnon says, well, no, I'm having her. And then he steps out of the fighting, so I'm not going to fight anymore. And the poem covers that period of his stepping back. And in the end, as you probably know, he's willing to let his friend, his lover, again, the nature of the relationship is something that's been very much talked about and thought about. Patroclus, he lets him go off to fight wearing his armor, and Patroclus is then killed, and Achilles then goes back in to take revenge. So it's this one episode in the Trojan War. And the Odyssey, you probably know better. I think some of you are studying it.
Road A52 towards Station Road, then turn left onto Station Road.
Sorry, brilliant.
All right.
I did find my way.
Wonderful. Whereas the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus, who's been at Troy and is now making his way home. So the Iliad thinks very much about what it is to be human, in the sense what it is to be a human and not a god. And to be human and not a god means that you can die, and that's a real problem in the Iliad. The Iliad thinks a lot about the fact that human beings can be wounded and can die, and that human beings love other human beings who can be wounded and who can die. So it thinks about humanity in the sense of kind of being someone who can die, being someone who can be killed, and being someone who suffers. The gods in the Iliad they don't die, they live forever, and they have this kind of blessed life. The Iliad describes them as the gods, the blessed ones, who are forever. And it's very tied up. They don't suffer and they don't die, and that's kind of thought about together. There is an issue, an instance in the Iliad where these boundaries are kind of pushed, and we can come to that in a bit. But in general, the gods live this blessed life, and humans suffer and die, and the Iliad thinks about what that means. The Odyssey thinks a lot about humans as opposed to sort of non-humans, monsters, strange things. But it also thinks about humanity and mortality, less about being subject to death maybe, but more about being subject to change. To be human means that you grow old, you change, and it thinks about what that means. And it also thinks about being human in the sense of how we tell stories about ourselves, how we understand ourselves, how we construct ourselves as people. So I'm going to speak for the first kind of third about the Iliad, and then for the second 2/3 about the Odyssey, which you're probably more familiar with. So one of the ways in which the Iliad thinks about being human and about being mortal is by having these kind of halfway characters who are somewhere between being mortal and being immortal. And in order to kind of test these boundaries between human and immortal, it puts these characters in the middle. Most of the characters in the Iliad are kind of halfway characters in some way or another. So when we use the word hero, we might talk about a Homeric hero or the heroes in the Iliad. We mean hero in a few senses. So when we use the word hero today, sometimes we have a kind of moral sense to it. Oh, you know, she was such a hero. She went into that burning building and saved a baby. Or we talk about it in a kind of literary sense. You know, she's the hero of the story. And those senses can be useful for talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in ancient Greek thought, a hero or the heroes they're actually a specific kind of race of being. And there's this idea that, you know, we're human beings today, but in the past there was this race of heroes, and they were kind of made of different stuff. And sometimes you get these comments in the Iliad where Homer talks about like a big boulder, and he's like, oh, it was a big boulder, and like even today 5 normal human beings wouldn't be able to lift it, but back then they could just lift it right up. So this idea that humans were something different, and the heroes in particular are this kind of different race of beings. They're part way between being human and mortal, and lots of them have immortal parents. Sorry, between being human and immortal, and lots of them have immortal parents. There are some handouts here if you want to grab them. And as I say, the poem tests limits. So in book 5, there's a character Diomedes, and the goddess Athena says, I'm going to give you the special power that you'll be kind of stronger, but also you'll be able to tell on the battlefield who the gods are. You'll be able to see them. The gods move on the battlefield, but you will be able to see them. And you can push the limits of being human, Diomedes, and you can even wound the goddesses. And he does that. He wounds Aphrodite. But then he's put back into place. So there's this moment where the limits seem tested, and then he's put back into place. Achilles is another of these halfway characters, and his kind of halfwayness is really kind of thematized in his parents. So as I said, Thetis, who's this goddess, she's a nymph, and her husband Peleus, who's a mortal man, and it thinks about Achilles in the way he's kind of caught between being human and being divine. He has these kind of almost divine abilities. He's this incredible fighter. He runs very fast, but he is human, and he can die in the end. If not in the end of the Iliad, he doesn't die in the Iliad at all. It's one episode. So I've got this passage on the handout, which I've called Thetis, the death-haunted divinity. And because Thetis is in this place between being human and being, she's immortal, but she hangs out with humans. She's married to a human. And this causes real problems for her. So in this scene, this is from the end of the Iliad, book 24, and her son is he's grieving for Patroclus. He's kind of deeply sad, and she is kind of called by Zeus to take a message to him. So Iris goes down to meet her, and she says, what do the gods want with me? I'm ashamed to mingle with the immortals because I have a mess of sorrows in my heart. And she describes herself as being kind of messed up with the grief that comes from loving a human being who can suffer and die. But she says, I'll go up, and she wears this kind of black mourning garment, and she goes among the gods, and she just doesn't fit in there because the gods are the blessed ones, the happy ones who are forever, and she's deeply unhappy because she has this close connection with her mortal son whom she loves and whom she knows will die, and who's committed to be willing to die by going to take revenge for Patroclus. He knows he's going to die, she knows he's going to die, and that kind of puts a sort of spanner in her being immortal. Another quite interesting and quite charming way in which Homer thinks about what it is to be mortal, and sort of what it is to be human, is through this character in the Iliad who's a horse. And there are a few really interesting horses in the Iliad. Great book if you're into horses, great poem. But it's this horse called Pegasus. Interestingly, I'll just pause here. So I don't know, you've got the Penguin Classics copies, I see, of the Aeneid. And the first ever Penguin Classics in the 1940s was E.B. Vieux, who translated the Odyssey. That was the first Penguin Classic there ever was. And so he did the Odyssey, he had a great time, made this brilliant translation. And then the editors of Penguin Classics which maybe included him at the time, said, "Oh, will you do the Iliad? Will you do the Iliad?" And he tells in his introduction how he came to the Iliad and he's like, "Well, the Odyssey is great fun. It's a fantastic poem. The Iliad's just boring. I don't care that much about the Iliad, but sure, I'll translate it for you." And as he begins translating it, he falls in love with this poem. And he writes in the introduction, the feelings in the Iliad are just greater. And he says, "You will weep more for the death of a single horse in the Iliad than all the suitors in the Odyssey." And this is that single horse who dies. So again, we're thinking about these kind of touch points between mortality and immortality. And Achilles' chariot, which has been borrowed by Patroclus, has 3 horses which pull it, 2 immortal horses. And Homer gives us their genealogy. He says, "Oh, they're the children of a horse and the wind." The wind is a god in the Iliad, like rivers are gods and so on. So there are these immortal horses, and they run along together, but there runs with them this mortal horse. And the mortal horse Pegasus runs beside the immortal horses. So this mortal horse Pegasus is introduced at the beginning of book 16. And then many of the scenes in the Iliad, which is one of the things that makes it a little bit hard to approach when you come to it for the first time, is these battle scenes where someone throws a spear at someone and maybe they hit them, or we've got some nods here, and someone throws a spear at someone else and maybe they miss, and these exchanges of weapons. And what's amazing in this passage here is that we have this, again, completely typical, so Patroclus hits someone called Thrasimilus, and kills him. And then Sarpedon, one of the Trojans, responds throwing a spear, but tries to hit Patroclus but misses. And instead he hits Pegasus the horse. And Pegasus is kind of caught up in this human exchange of weapons and dies like a human being. Sarpedon missed him with a shining spear, making the second throw, but he hit Pegasus the horse with a spear in the right shoulder. And this is exactly how humans are described dying. They say, "Oh, he hit him at this point in his body." It's very anatomical, the concern with death in the Iliad. He hit him with a spear in the right shoulder, and he screamed as he breathed out his life, and he fell down in the dust, whining, and his soul flew away, which is very, very similar to the way in which human death in the Iliad is described. So we have in Pegasus the horse this kind of almost a mirror of humanness. We interact alongside the immortals, but we're woundable and killable, and we die. And then really charmingly in the next book, the immortal horses who survive, right, the 2 who were in the pair, they cry about Patroclus because they're really sad that their charioteer has died. And Zeus looks at these crying immortal horses, and he feels this big affinity with the horses because they're immortal like him. And he says, seeing them both weeping, he pities them, and he shook his head and he spoke in his own spirit. "Ah, you 2 wretches, why did we give the 2 of you to the Lord Peleus?" Peleus is the mortal husband of Thetis, right? Achilles' dad. "A mortal, when you 2 are unaging and immortal, just so that you should have sorrows along with unhappy men? For there is nothing anywhere more pitiable than a human being of all the creatures that breathe and crawl on the earth." So the horses become this way of thinking about the difference between mortals who suffer and the immortals who don't. The most deeply moving scene in the Iliad is arguably the scene in the final book where Priam, the father of Hector, whom Achilles has killed, comes to get his son's body from Achilles. It's incredibly important in Greek religion to be able to bury the bodies of one's dead. And this elderly, frail, desperately grieving man who's lost his son comes to Achilles, who murdered his son, and says, please can I have his body back so I can bury it? And it's this incredible scene where this old frail man goes into the camp of the Greeks and goes into the kind of hut, the kind of battle camp of this terrifying warrior who killed his son. And he approaches him and he does what the Greeks call, what we call supplication, where he kind of confers this religious obligation on Achilles. He holds his knees, which is how you supplicate someone, but he goes even further than supplicating it, and he kisses his hand. And he's aware as he kisses Achilles' hand that this is the hand that killed his son. And Priam speaks to Achilles and he says, Achilles, like the gods, remember your father, who is of years like mine, who is as old as I am, and on the doorsill of sorrowful old age. So he's in the period of old age, which is kind of a door into death. Yet surely he, when he hears of you and that you are still living, is gladdened within his heart, and all his days he is hopeful that he will see his beloved son come home from come home from Troy. But as for me, my destiny was evil. I have had the noblest of sons in Troy, but I say not one of them is left to me. Honor then the gods, Achilles, and take pity on me, remembering your father. Yet I am still more pitiful. I have gone through what no other mortal on earth has gone through. I put my lips to the hands of the man who has killed my children. So he spoke and stirred in the other, in Achilles, a passion of grieving for his own father. Achilles took the old man's hand and pushed him gently away, and the two remembered as Priam sat huddled at the feet of Achilles and wept for manslaughtering Hector. And Achilles wept now for his own, Priam is weeping for manslaughtering Hector, and Achilles wept now for his own father, now again for Patroclus. So we have these two men who both lost people they deeply love, who kind of find this moment of solidarity, and they weep together. And then they have to do what humans do, and they have a meal because you're human and you have to eat. And Priam says, look, I know you haven't eaten for days, but you just have to eat, and we're going to have this meal together. And they respect all of the conventions of Greek hospitality. When someone comes to visit you in Greece, you give them a meal. They do all the kind of formal rituals of being human, because actually there's nothing else you can do when you're grieving. You have to eat, you have to keep going, you have to kind of do the whole pleasantries thing, and they do that, and then the fighting resumes, and life and death goes on. So their suffering and their humanity, both their humanity in the sense of kind of mortality and their humanity in the sense of compassion, unites them. And Achilles does this kind of long spiel on what it is to be a human being, and he recognizes that there are people worse off even than he is, and that the human condition is just characterized by suffering, but also by the possibility of compassion and of kind of drawing connections to other people in your suffering. I'm going to pause at this stage. I'm going to have a little sip of water, and then we can think a bit about the Odyssey. If something doesn't make sense as we go along, you can stick up a hand in the middle as well, that's fine. But we can definitely do questions at the end. Okay, the Odyssey. So lots of the Odyssey is about storytelling. The most famous parts of the poem, if you said to one of your parents who hadn't read the Odyssey, oh, what happens in the Odyssey, would say, ah, Cyclops. That's the stuff that people think of often. And these really famous bits come from the stories that Odysseus tells the Phaeacians about his travels when he washes up there. We actually don't know whether these things are true or not. These are the stories that he tells. So Odysseus tells stories, Penelope tells her story later, or maybe come to that. But as well as them, there are not one, but two kind of professional storytellers in the Odyssey. And they're not so much storytellers as story singers. They do the same kind of thing that Homer did. They sing these long, long story poems. So the two that we meet in the Odyssey are Phemius, who sings songs in Odysseus' house while Penelope is kind of trying to keep house there, and Demodocus, who sings songs at the court of the Phaeacians. So in the bit in the middle where Odysseus is on the island of the Phaeacians, which is this kind of fantastical island, which is really kind of luxurious. They talk about how much they love, it's this really charming bit, they love changes of clothes and having baths and going to bed. Which is great. So they have this fantastic poet who sings to them. And Demodocus tells this very funny story about the gods. But there's a sense that what the people listening want from stories is human connection. They praise Odysseus and they say, you tell stories as if you were there. And of course, there's a kind of wry smile for the audience there, because he's telling stories from Troy and he was there. But there's this sense that stories promote compassion, this kind of Iliad 24 style, empathizing with one's enemies because of one's shared mortality, which includes the capacity to love other mortals who die. So there's this amazing passage where Odysseus, this is handout 9 now, Demodocus tells this story about the Trojan horse and the Odysseus attack on Troy. which, enables Odysseus to do these very violent things with all the other Greeks, to murder all the men, to rape the women, and to take them off into slavery. And Odysseus responds and he cries. Odysseus, and this is now the translation of Emily Wilson, who's just made an absolutely brilliant translation of the Odyssey, which I really recommend. Odysseus was melting into tears. His cheeks were wet with weeping, as a woman weeps, as she falls to wrap her arms around her husband, fallen fighting for his home and children. She is watching as he gasps and dies. She shrieks, a clear, high wail collapsing upon his corpse. The men are right behind. They hit her shoulders with their spear and lead her to slavery, hard labor, and a life of pain. Her face is marked with her despair. In that same way, Odysseus was crying. But he responds to this story about himself by crying like one of the women he's hurt. And there's this kind of strange moment where there's almost this role reversal, where through listening to this story, Odysseus becomes like his own victims. One interesting thing that happens much earlier in the poem, in book 4, is that Telemachus, Odysseus' son, goes to visit Helen and Menelaus. And I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, that Homer is a bit suspicious of Helen. Homer as a poet, as a narrator, is not really sure how he feels about Helen. Helen's about to tell the men who've come to visit a story, but before she gives them these drugs, and this is the description we have of the drugs, Helen decided she would mix the wine with drugs to take all pain and rage away, to bring forgetfulness of every evil. Whoever drinks this mixture from the bowl will shed no tears that day, not even if her mother or her father die, nor even if soldiers kill her brother or her darling son with bronze spears before her very eyes. So these drugs that on the one hand mean that you don't have pain or sorrow, but they also mean that you can't have sorrow for someone else's sufferings. And if we think in terms of the response that Odysseus had to Demodocus' story, these drugs would have prevented that response. And so there's a way in which they're kind of anti-story drugs. You tell a story and you just can't have any feelings because of it. These very, very strange drugs. And imagine what problems that causes for you if you're Homer and you're the poet. You can tell these stories and no one's going to respond. It's a very odd, uneasy moment. So one of the things at issue in the Odyssey is the kind of value of pain. It's nice to forget. It's nice not to have to remember. But actually, if you don't remember and you don't have, pain, you will just get stuck in this place like Phaeacia, where you just hang around and have a nice time, and you don't get what in the end you want, which for Odysseus is getting back home, which we'll think about in a minute. There's also this element, so there's this kind of storytelling to promote a shared humanity, but we also find storytelling to stay alive. I don't know if any of you know the 1001 Arabian Nights, the story of Scheherazade. Any nods to Scheherazade? We have a couple of nods, maybe. So the story of Scheherazade is that there's this king. So this is from Arabian storytelling, not from Greek storytelling. But there's this king and his wife sleeps with someone else, and he's so angry that he says he's going to marry a woman every night, and at the end of the night he'll kill her and he'll marry someone else. And Scheherazade, when she's married to the king, is like, okay, you can kill me, but first let me tell a story to my little sister. And she tells her little sister the story, it's an amazing story. And the night goes on, it gets later and later, and then she stops. Big cliffhanger. And the king says, no, keep going. And she says, no. I'm really fine. I've got to go to sleep. I'll tell you the rest of the story tomorrow. And so he says, fine, I'll wait. And so she finishes the story the next day, but then she starts another one. She keeps going. And then she says, no. I've got to get to sleep now. I'll tell the rest of the story tomorrow. And this goes on and on and on for 1001 nights. She tells these amazing stories. And by the end of it, he has decided that he's in love with her and isn't going to kill her. Fantastic. But this idea that you tell stories to stay alive. And And there's something of this in the Odyssey. Odysseus is telling these stories to stay alive. So in the most obvious sense, when he turns up at the Phaeacians, he's very vulnerable. He's just been kind of cast on the shore. He's got absolutely nothing. And they welcome him in quite cautiously. And he says eventually, okay, let me tell you my story. I'm the great hero Odysseus, whom you've heard of, and here's my story. And he tells these stories. And so the stories in some way keep him alive, they keep him safe. But there's this more unsettling theme in the Odyssey, that the opposite of storytelling is sleep. And this kind of continues the theme that I was kind of touching on with Helen and these drugs. There's kind of sleep and forgetfulness, and there's storytelling and pain, but being alive. And there are a couple of times when storytelling is kind of explicitly contrasted with sleep, and we have this kind of Scheherazade type motif. So one of them is Alcinous, who's the king of the Phaeacians, and he's trying to get Odysseus to tell his story. And he says, the night is long, it's not time to sleep yet. Tell me more amazing deeds. And in Greek, these amazing deeds are the kind of stuff of epic poetry. So tell me more, epic poets. I would keep listening until bright daybreak if you kept on telling the dangers that have passed. And then later in the poem, when Odysseus finally gets back to Ithaca, his home, there's this episode where he goes and he hangs out with the man he kept in slavery, Eumaeus, who heard the pigs. And he tells Eumaeus a kind of version of his story, and Eumaeus tells him about his life. And Eumaeus is encouraging Odysseus, who's at this stage still in disguise and actually telling lies about himself. He says, you need not sleep too early. It's unhealthy. Early bedtime, that's unhealthy. Any other man who feels the need of sleep should go lie down, get up at dawn, have breakfast, and go herd the master's pigs. But let us, you and I, sit in my cottage over food and wine, and take some joy in hearing how much pain we have suffered. After many years of agony and absence from one's home, a person can begin enjoying grief. I will tell you my story as you ask. And so they tell stories instead of going to sleep. The Odyssey as a poem seems not to want to end. There are a number of places where it could end. So Odysseus comes home. So of course, in some ways, the Odyssey is all about Odysseus' struggle to get home. He physically arrives back in Ithaca in book 13, right? Only just over halfway through. So he's been home for ages by the end. So it could end there when he gets home. The other really obvious ending that lots of us want to be the ending is the reunifying with Penelope in book 23. They come together, they're in the amazing bed that he's made, and that would be a really nice ending. But it doesn't end there. There's a whole other book. There's this resistance in the Odyssey to end it. The poem doesn't want to end. I wonder whether there's this sense, Odysseus, while he's back in Ithaca, he tells these, so while he's in Phaeacia, he tells the stories about himself, allegedly. And then when he's back in Ithaca, he tells what scholars call the Cretan lies, right? He tells these stories, I was a man in Crete and blah, blah, blah. So these are kind of false versions of his life. But he keeps telling stories and the poem keeps going. And maybe there's this fear that once he stops telling stories, we'll need to go to sleep and the story will finish. I'm going to have a little drink and then continue with the third section. So in other ways, the Odyssey is about attempts to pause or rewind time. It's about Odysseus' hope to kind of get back to where he was, but also kind of at the time he was. I don't know if you've ever been away from somewhere for a long time, maybe your primary school, and you go back and you kind of expect that it would be exactly like it was when you left. But of course, that's never quite the case. So Odysseus is offered immortality, and immortality, ideally in the ancient world, is tied up with you're immortal, you don't die, and you're unaging, you don't get old. And Odysseus is offered this. Calypso, the nymph, who's a goddess, she offers him, and we've got this on handout 13, she offers him to be immortal like her and never to grow old. And she says, do you really want to go back to that home you love so much? Well, then goodbye. But if you understood how glutted you will be with suffering before you reach home, you would stay here with me and be immortal, though you might still wish to see that wife you always pine for. And anyway, I know my body is better than hers is. I'm taller too. Mortals can never rival the immortals in beauty. So Odysseus, with tact, said, do not be enraged at me, great goddess. You are quite right. I know my modest wife Penelope could never match your beauty. She is a human. You are deathless, ageless. But even so, I want to go back home, and every day I hope that day will come. So he gets this opportunity to be immortal and unaging, and he says, no, I want to go home to my old wife, my aging wife, who's not as pretty as this goddess, and that's okay. It's convenient that it's okay at this point, and that there are other times in the story where he makes a different choice, right? Even though he seems to have accepted mortality and aging, he still seems to have this fantasy that he can turn back time, that he'll go back to his old palace with his wife and his child, whom he still remembers as a baby, and he'll take up his position in an unchanged household. The death of Argos, the dog, is maybe the first sign that this can't work, right? Humans are maybe the ones he left are still alive when he gets back, but dogs just don't live that long. And his dog dies, and he's never getting back to where he was. So there's this scene in book 24, again, maybe because as a culture we really prioritize, or at least traditionally we kind of prioritize heterosexual marriages. So we want the book to end in book 23, but actually Odysseus and maybe Homer are also really interested in other things like land and paternity. So what we have in book 24 is the kind of restoration of all of that. So he reclaims his orchard, which is the land of Ithaca that he wants to get back to, at least as much as he wants to get back to his wife. He wants to get back to his land. And crucially, this is the land that his father has given him. So you've got this kind of patriline, this kind of father to son inheritance. And it's the land that he and his father have named together. So there's this real kind of male line ownership of land, which is really important in Greek thought. He hides himself and pretends not to be Odysseus in front of his father. And then eventually he's like, no, don't worry, I am your son. And Laertes is a bit suspicious. His dad is a bit suspicious. And he says, if you really are my own son, Odysseus, come home, show me a sign. Let me be sure of it. Odysseus is quick to answer, and he talks about something else. And then he says, now I will tell you all the trees that grow in this fine orchard, which you gave to me. When I was little, I would follow you around the garden, asking all their names. We walked beneath these trees. You named them all and promised them to me. 10 apple trees and 13 pear trees, 40 figs and 50 grapevines. So this reclaiming of his paternal inheritance. The Odyssey is really anxious about paternity. There's this moment in book 1 where Athena says, you're Odysseus' son. And Telemachus is like, well, my mum says I'm Odysseus' son, but no one ever really knows who his father is. So there's this kind of reassuring reaffirmation of paternity at the end of the Odyssey. So he seems to get back to where he was, to this orchard that he got from his dad. With Athena's help, towards the end of the Odyssey, she makes him into this beggar, this old, fragile beggar. She says, I will disguise you so no human can recognize you. I'll shrivel up the fine skin of your supple arms. I'll shrivel up the fine skin of your supple arms and legs, ruin your hair, and dress you up in rags, and everyone will shudder seeing you. And I will cloud your eyes to make you seem ugly to all the suitors and your wife and to the son you left at home. So he's old and ugly for a bit, but it's just this disguise, right? It's a kind of costume, and you can take off the costume, and Athena does. She's like, right, okay, we've done all this testing. Now we're going to reveal him to his wife. So I'll like put on a young costume. I'll make him young again. And in fact, I'll make him as young as he ever was when he left. So we have here. And then Athena poured attractiveness from head to toe and made him taller and stronger. And his hair grew thick and curly as a hyacinth. As when a craftsman, and this is a really interesting summary here, as when a craftsman whom Athena or Hephaestus has trained in metalwork so he can make beautiful artifacts, pours gold on silver, so she poured beauty on his head and shoulders. After his bath, he looked like an immortal. So she can put old age on him as a costume, and she can put youth on him as a costume, as an artifact, like a craft work, right? So there's this kind of fantasy for Odysseus that you can turn back time. Maybe you'll be old, but you can be unold again. Penelope knows that you can't pause time. She's tried. She tries one of the most famous things in the Odyssey is this weaving trick, right? She says, I can't marry you until I finish the shroud for my father-in-law, and she weaves it during the day, and then at night she unweaves it, and then she keeps going the next day, and then she unweaves it. Most people who know this bit about the Odyssey assume that she does this for 20 years. In fact, in Homer's poem, she does it for 4 years, and then they find her out and they make her stop. The trick doesn't work. She tries to pause time and it doesn't work. So in book 24, the suitors who've been killed by Odysseus, they speak in the underworld and they explain, by day she wove the cloth, and then at night by torchlight she unwove it. For 3 long years she fooled us. When the hours and months had passed, the 4th year rolled around, and then a girl who knew the truth told us, and we found her unraveling her work. We made her finish it. So Penelope's tried to stop time and she's failed, and she knows that it doesn't work. And when she finally recognizes Odysseus, in this poem so full of shape-shifting and fantasy, she quietly delivers what are perhaps its most honest, realistic lines. She says to him, the gods have made us suffer. They refuse to let us stay together and enjoy our youth until we reach the edge of age together. She says, actually, it's never coming back. We could have been young together and we weren't allowed to be, and now we're old. And that youth that we could have had together, it's gone, and we're never, ever getting it back. The gods live forever, but for humans, time passes and we can't get it back. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Katherine very much for very rich talk, I think. There's lots of topics there that have opened up again. And she said very kindly that she will take some questions. So what I'd say to everyone, particularly the younger people in the audience, do remember there are no right answers in the classics. So whatever you say is not wrong, so to speak. So don't feel shy in that respect. And also argue. When I was a student, I loved to argue with my lecturers, and I suspect Katherine, like me, enjoys arguing with different points of view anyway. So if anyone has got a question for Katherine, to say she's very kindly, and she's nodding vigorously, very kindly offered to answer them. So please do fire away.
I'm going to break the ice a bit because I know people are going to be shy. So I'm going to ask a couple of my students who have a very different view of Odysseus to come forward and to see what you and Andy perhaps who you feel is who you agree with more. So Jess and Joe, if you could come forward. They're very happy to with a smaller class, so I'm putting them on the spot a bit with a bigger group, but we're all friends here, aren't we? Now, these two, Jess and Joe, have recently, along with their classmates, they've written an essay exploring...
Just a word of warning, Cassie, that the two do know that they're now possibly on the edge of the... And if they're happy with that, that's fine. Yeah.
Oh, you okay? Right. They've recently written an essay on Odysseus' leadership skills and who's to blame for what goes on in decline. And they were on a very different page regarding Odysseus. So I'm going to let them tell you what their view was, and I'd be interested in how you, Katherine and Andy, how you respond to their views. So, Jess, do you want to tell us what conclusions you came to on Odysseus and his leadership, specifically looking at design and a little bit of 10 as well?
So I really don't like Odysseus as a character. He gets himself into a lot of unnecessary trouble just so he can have sort of a better chaos, better reputation. And I feel like he really doesn't value anyone's life other than his own. I want to know how you feel about him as a leader. Sure.
Personally, I think I think all the choices that he makes for different reasons. So with the chaos, it's very much a cultural thing. Heroes gaining their reputation and improving, the stories that are told about them. Whereas now, obviously, it would be like, when it comes to him being a leader, I think he saves all the men that he can with, like, it's like, oh, why can't they just run the rock? They can't move the rock. They've got to disarm the Cyclops and save themselves and themselves in the sheep. It was like, in every way, it's a brilliant way of it.
Jen used the word genius a lot to describe Odysseus, but Jess was more concerned about a leader should safeguard the people they lead. They should keep them safe and not go off at an unnecessary tangent just so you can have this wonderful chaos and you can do outstanding things. So the same man, but provoking such different reactions from people.
Right, and I think that's one of the ways that the poem works. It offers us that question. I don't think it gives us a straightforward answer. There's one thing I would ask you is, how do we know what happens in the Cyclops story? Where does that come in the story?
The event section.
Yeah.
Odysseus retells.
Right, where Odysseus retells the story. Right. And I really think that he's trying to figure out how responsible he is. He's telling this story. So one scholar has kind of taken a kind of therapeutic approach, and I think of this as like Odysseus in therapy, and he's trying to make sense of what's happened and what's done and how much he's at fault. And he tells this story where he seems both to be justifying his own decisions, and I think he does seem to be aware, and that's why we can have this other sense of the story, that actually he made these mistakes, and he goes into the Cyclops cave because he wants presents. He wants goods to come back, and yeah, he comes up with his genius solution. But I think he's kind of negotiating how far he feels he's to blame and what he wants to tell these other people on whom his life depends about what he is and what he's done. I think the chaos as a motivation thing is a really interesting one, and that's one that's extremely important in the Iliad. And the Odyssey seems sometimes to be saying, well, actually, how helpful is this really? When you go in pursuit of chaos and it costs you the lives of your people, and how does that balance out? And I don't know whether you've looked at the sirens, but the sirens, so again, the way that most people know of them is they have this beautiful singing, and if you listen to them, you just listen forever and then you forget to eat and you die. And he says, well, no, I really want to listen. I don't want to die, but I want to listen. So these amazing pictures that come out of both the Greek world and modern art of Odysseus kind of tied to his mast, and all the sailors with the earwax in so that they don't hear. And what the sirens do is they say, "You're Odysseus." Actually, let me see if I can get it from. I have my copy here. But they basically say, we've heard of your famous deeds, and let's sing to you a song of your famous deeds. So Emily Wilson has it like this. She says, "Odysseus, come here. You are well known from many stories. You've got all this chaos. Glory of the Greeks. Now stop your ship and listen to our voices. All those who pass this way hear honeyed song poured from our mouths. The music brings them joy, and they go on their way with greater knowledge. Since we know everything the Greeks and Trojans suffered in Troy by God's will, and we know whatever happens anywhere on earth." And some scholars have pointed out that a lot of the terms used here are quite Iliadic, that they look a lot like the Iliad. And there's this idea that Odysseus is a kind of Iliadic character in a different story. And there's a sense that he's already a storybook character. And that's really tempting. It's not just that they're singing any old song, they're singing like the How Great Odysseus Is song. And that's a good song, and he wants to listen. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I don't know. As a historian, perhaps I'm not allowed to say. No, I think certainly that there is a tension there. I would also say the important thing to remember at one level is that there is a stress, I think, on leadership looking after people. I mean, the poimen laon, the shepherd of his people, is a standard epithet for some Homeric heroes. So they're meant to look after people. On the other hand, this is a very hierarchical society. Most of us in this society count for diddly squat. And just think about the way that people die. So great heroes manage to get up to heaven, and they have a continuing personal life. Most of us end up as part of a gibbering mass of the dead, and we don't really matter at the end of the day. So winning Kleos can be, I think, prioritised. And there is there is an interesting tension there. The other interesting tension, I'd say, I don't know if Katherine would agree with me, is that actually the poet of the Odyssey works it so that, in fact, the men are worse than Odysseus at looking after themselves. In the end, of course, they're wiped out because they, against their leader's advice, kill and eat the cattle of the sun, which they're not meant to do. And Odysseus tells them, don't touch these things, you'll be in trouble. And they do, and they end up in trouble. In fact, they wind up dead. So there is a very harsh tension there. But certainly, I think in this culture, a search for honor, and again, if you want another word as well as kleos, maybe time, so time with a line over the last E, the search for honor is desperately important in this society. And to some degree, it will trump things. And again, I'd agree with Katherine, at times we can see in the Odyssey a tension there where it takes people too far. So, you know, Odysseus can't resist. And in a way, I don't think the sort of person he is as a hero, he'd be able to resist boasting to the Cyclops, I've had you at the end, yep. And that brings trouble in its wake as well. But if he doesn't do that, he's not a hero, because you've got to rejoice in your power, as another poet, Virgil, says, exultans we. Yep. So now I am the main man, and I'm going to shout that out, because that's showing you I'm the main man. Those two things can't be separated at that level. So I would say there are problems with Odysseus, but I think actually I would come down on the side of him being a great man rather than a weak man as a leader. But whether that makes him a nice man is an interesting question. And when one looks back, and I'm a Romanist mainly at this man, he has a very bad reputation in the Roman world because he's a weaselly, tricky sort of guy. He wins by tricking rather than doing what you should do, which is go up to somebody and beat their brains out with a sharpened piece of metal. Yeah, that's what a real man does. Odysseus doesn't do this. His weapon is the bow. That's a sneaky weapon. You kill people at long distance, and you don't have to show your manliness. So there is a deep tension in this guy, but I also think the poet means us to admire the way he uses his brain to get out of tight corners. So whether we're meant to think, he should never have got in that tight corner in the first place, is a very interesting question. Now Katherine will tell you why all of that is wrong.
I won't keep going over. I think, but as I say, it is an open question. If you wanted to think more about it, have you seen Emily Wilson's translation? It's really fascinating. It's really good. It's got this long introduction, and it has a section called "Hated Odysseus." Odysseus' name means kind of it comes from sort of words around hate, and she looks at this question of actually whether he's hateful or not. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, they talked about Odysseus's ability to get out of sticky situations and how resourceful and how cunning he is. Another area that we've looked at, Eli, can I bring in you at this point? It was, is there something going on in Book 9 where Homer's, the way it's written, is encouraging us to feel some sympathy for the Cyclops? The scholar Peter Walcott has written about that. Eli, could you share with us how you felt about the Cyclops, whether you saw it simply as Odysseus puts it, as this barbaric brute, or whether some sympathy could be had for him?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a Cyclops sympathizer. I quite like him. I feel like as I read the Odyssey, I read it in a very contemporary way. I'm looking at a man breaking into what is presented as a monster's home, but is looking for a very human and what would be a very nice gift or something like that. And that throughout, the Polyphemus is it's part of his culture to be a monster, or the way that Odysseus is showing him as a monster, and that as it's Odysseus' retelling his perception of this creature could be insanely changed from to another level to make himself feel better.
Yeah, no, I think there are really important things there, and you're right that it's this retelling by Odysseus. And yeah, and the question of culture is really important because Odysseus says there's no culture among the Cyclops, you know, as a kind of species, because you know they all just live on their own. It's everyone for themselves, and they don't have any kind of respect for society. And then actually, I don't know if you remember what happens when the Cyclops gets wounded. But all the other, sorry, go on.
Yeah, the other Cyclops. Right?
Yeah.
So nothing's going.
Right, and so that's where the trick works.
Yeah.
No one's hurt me. But they all want to help, right?
Yeah.
So there's Odysseus saying, oh, these people like no culture, no society at all. Actually, you know, the text goes on to show that's not the case.
And I think there's quite a good duality between that and later on with the bag of wind in it, where the men there's no culture between them at that point, and I feel like there's lots of like similarities where Odysseus is compared to himself from a time. So it's like when he abandons his men at the last reunions, and then later on where he tries his best to save as many as he can, and there's a real duality to him and a real duality to their
I think, yeah, the Cyclops does come across as very sympathetic. You know, he's friends with this ram, and he sort of strokes him and is nice to him, and you know, he's in his little cave making cheese. You know, I think and you know, and then he eats human beings and smashes them against the wall like puppets, right? But I mean, that's really weird as a reading experience. That he comes across as being both very gentle and very violent. You know, there's this theme about hospitality, xenia, in the Odyssey, and the conventions of hospitality, which are the same conventions as the ones I alluded to at the end of Iliad 24. And you know, Odysseus kind of expects these conventions to work. He's like, well, I turn up in your house, you'll tend to give me a present, and the Cyclops is like, well, you just came in here and like stole my stuff, and you ate my cheese. And I think, yeah, duality is a really helpful word there. There's this tension and this odd reading experience where you've got kind of two things going on in your head, where you know you've got Odysseus saying, "Oh, he's a monster," you know, they all don't care about each other.
Yeah, that kind of leads me on to a second question. Would you say that Odysseus is redeemable? Because again, there's that duality of a man that's participated in war and crimes of war, which is like counted in the things at the first episode of the and like compared to when he's like crying as he imagines himself as the wife of a man that he's slaughtered. And it's like a real contrast between his past and his present, and it really conflicts for me very often. So I find myself sympathising with him, and then I'm like,
right, which is the mark of a well-written character, right? That they're neither someone you can completely sympathise with nor someone you can't sympathise with at all. And I think again there's this sense when he kills all the suitors, but also all the people he keeps in slavery, or almost all of them, and it's vicious. The way he kills them is absolutely vicious. And I think even there's this sense that, well, okay, you know, he's getting his house back, which is like ethically the right thing to do, but the kind of sheer violence meted out against these enslaved girls is really quite a lot. And I think there's this tension even there. Yeah.
And do you think the Cyclops, Homer intends the Cyclops to be, to an extent, a sympathetic character, a victim of a situation?
Oh, well, Kathy, you know that the answer to that question is no. I'm very much more straightforward about this. I think that the Cyclops is meant to be an anti-human character. I mean, the fact there is no community is stressed very heavily. And actually, it's quite interesting, again, as a Romanist, if one thinks about the way, say, the Roman historian Tacitus presents the Germans are the ultra-barbarians because they all live apart from one another. There's no community and everyone has their own little bit, and they're very hostile to people intruding onto that little bit. I think the breaking of xenia is very, very important in this. The Cyclops is clearly out of order, and the grotesque nature of him being out of order is emphasised in spades, isn't it? You know, bashing people's brains out and such like. The sympathy, I mean, I think is interesting, but I would say myself that, you know, when he strokes his ram and all the rest of it, the reader is meant to react to that as sort of hypocritical crocodile tears. This is the monster who goes in for a bit of self-pity after behaving in an absolutely appalling way. So I don't have a lot of sympathy with people who have sympathy for the Cyclops in that sense. Yeah, it's a little bit like Tolkien. People who read Tolkien say, oh, the orcs had a point. Well, no, they didn't. The whole point of the narrative of Tolkien is that the orcs are the anti-side, and we are meant to perceive them in that way. As regards redemption, I think that's very interesting. I would say, though, that if Odysseus is redeeming himself, he's redeeming himself against insults he's doled out to gods, particularly Poseidon, rather than war. I don't think war is remotely problematic for the classical Greeks, and I think excellence in war, which involves killing lots of people, is something which actually would be regarded as a plus. So when people are listening to this story, I think that part of him, and remember, he also tells a story where he descends as a pirate on Egypt, and no one worries about that. Again, that's a perfectly respectable thing to do in this society. But breaching the rules of hospitality, I think, and the way the Cyclops behaves, I think we're meant to see there, if you like, a very, very negative force that Odysseus deals with. And I would see the sympathy there as actually something that really, you know, that with the ram and what have you, that really underlines this guy. And I would see that self-pity. But as you can see, people have very, very different views. So Catherine's green, so she's thinking, what an idiot, which is possibly right. Yeah?
I'm thinking, isn't it fun that we have different views? Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely you, please.
I was going to say, like, what do you think of sort of the start of the Odyssey, how before we actually see Odysseus' story, we get Telemachus? What do you think the effect of that is, that we see sort of Odyssey with Telemachus before we actually see the autonomous character?
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think mini Odyssey is really helpful. I think that is very much what it is. I think some scholars call it the Telemachy. I can have the Odyssey and the Telemachy. So I think it does a number of things. There's two things that I'm particularly interested in. I talked about the way that the Odyssey thinks about who Odysseus is through the stories that are told about him. And the beginning of the Odyssey sees Telemachus figuring that out. He's like, I want to go and learn more about my dad. And so he goes to Menelaus, who knew him, and he goes to Nestor, who knew him, and he goes to these men who knew his father to find out more about him. And I think that both is, you know, speaks to a human desire to want to understand ourselves through maybe our parents or our families, and it sets up these questions about who is Odysseus, and Odysseus as a person who's talked about by other people, and as someone who different people view in different ways and talk about. And it's also part of this kind of paternity and identity theme. Who is Telemachus? Well, he's the son of Odysseus. But to know who it is to be the son of Odysseus, you have to know who Odysseus is. And as I say, the poem, looking at this kind of triad of paternity, Laertes and Odysseus and Telemachus, is kind of thinking about those relationships. And there's also this question in terms of kind of time and change of Telemachus needing to kind of come of age. And those four books are kind of his coming of age. And that's a theme that is very much stressed in the book. I mean, the problem in Ithaca is that time has kind of paused, but it also hasn't. And that's true very much of Telemachus. He's kind of an eternal child, but also he's old now and needs to find his place in society. And he kind of can't do that if his dad is missing and his mum is kind of managing the property. And so it's again working out the tensions of what happens when you kind of try to stop time and it doesn't really work. Is that, well, your son's in this really awkward position because he's neither a child nor is he an adult who's inherited the property. And it's kind of figuring that out. Does that make sense? Is that how, I mean, I wonder what you think it does.
Sort of introducing us to sort of Odysseus, like as a sort of kind of like a figure that we kind of like a famous figure that people talk about, and he's like a legend, and then it's sort of like a shift to this, the way that like Menelaus looks like Odysseus and Hector looks like the scene of Odysseus on Calypso's island, sort of feeling sorry for himself. I think it's really interesting to introduce who's supposed to be compared to who's trying to be.
Yeah, and of course in book one we also get Phemius, who sings these songs, right, including songs about Troy, in which Odysseus not featured.
Homer intended to portray the father and son when you first meet them as being made a bit disconsolate. They're not the big hero, they're actually men who are broken down by them.
Yeah, maybe. I think there definitely are parallels. These men who are just kind of sitting there and are sad and not really doing what they're needing to be doing. And there are parallels across the poem between father and son and father and son. That's better.
Another interesting thing that you've been looking at is Odysseus' infidelities. And I was reading a scholar who was saying that they don't matter so much because they're not damaging the oikos, they're not damaging the household like Penelope would if she engaged in infidelity, like Clytemnestra did. It's like an away from home thing. And yet the modern day students still find it difficult to look at us not be very critical of Odysseus and see how patient and loyal Penelope has been.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So certainly there's this double standard in the ancient world. So certainly there's this double standard in the ancient world, as in like many modern societies, right, including often our own, where particularly, exactly as you say, because of inheritance and because of paternity, and the uncertainty always of paternity. And one of the things I find really interesting on this front is that I don't know if you know, there are these companies where you can take a DNA test and they're like, oh, and this is your ancestry and so on. And I read in one place, and again, I'm not sure how reliable this is, so don't quote it, but that 1 in 10 of these kits that get sent off come back with what they euphemistically call paternity discrepancy. The father is not the person that one thought the father was, because you can't know. And that's just something that humans have always had to deal with. And the Odyssey and ancient Greek society in general is really, really worried about that. Partly because resources are scarce and there's this anxiety that you might be looking after a child who's not your own. Although that doesn't quite work out, because we see lots of evidence in the Iliad and the Odyssey of adoptive or kind of foster families, where someone comes in from another family and is looked after in that family, in a different family. But yeah, there's this real anxiety about paternity, which means that there's this big double standard where it's expected that men, there are certain conventions, men can't do anything. So by classical Athens in particular, men, for example, rape the girls that they keep in slavery, but they try and do it out of the way of their wife, so their wife doesn't see. And absolutely you can go and use prostitutes, but you don't bring the prostitute into your house because that's rude. So there is a double standard, there are tensions. Really interestingly, one of the characters in the Odyssey brings up this double standard, and it's Calypso, and Hermes says, you can't really be with this mortal man, that's not really okay, he's got to go on his way. And she says, you male gods are always like this. You sleep with lots of mortal women, but suddenly when an immortal woman, a goddess, sleeps with a mortal man, you've got a problem. What's that about? So it's not entirely a modern question, although clearly the ethics are different and sometimes less different than we would like them to be. But yeah, all those things are kind of at play in Odyssey very much. And Penelope is a really interesting one, because Penelope is in a really difficult situation. She's managing her husband's property until he gets back, but actually maybe she can't do it anymore, and she's kind of right at the end of what she can manage. And different scholars think different things about the various kind of tests she does with the suitor. So there's this moment when she appears to the suitors, sort of dressed up very beautifully, kind of to flirt with them, and Odysseus, who's in disguise, sees her and he says, "Ah, this is such a smart move of hers. She's kind of pretending to flirt with them so that they give her more presents, and she's recuperating my wealth for me." Maybe that's what's happening. We never know. Possibly Penelope has been like, actually, I just can't go on doing this anymore. I'm in a really insecure position. I need to be married in a household where like my husband has control of the property, which just isn't the case here. I'm going to have to pick one. And there is this, one of the suitors is introduced by the poet, and he and the suitor, and I've forgotten his name it is now, I'm afraid. She, sorry, the poet says, and Penelope kind of liked this one a bit more than the other ones. And there's the uneasiness of the dream with the geese. I don't know if any of you remember that, where she dreams that she has these pet geese, and she feeds the pet geese, and then this eagle comes down and he kills them all, and she's really sad. And Odysseus, again still in disguise, is like, "Oh, that's a fantastic omen. It means your husband's going to come back and he's going to kill all the suitors. Fantastic." But Penelope in the dream is sad. She's sad that the suitors died. And I think she's this really complicated figure, and she's quite inscrutable. And maybe the poet is not sure how to feel about her. We never really know what she's thinking.
Thank you. I just asked some of our students to come in with their opinions on Telemachus and Penelope. You sometimes get questions along the lines of, is Telemachus a worthy son of Odysseus? Does he fill those shoes? Alex, what do you think on Telemachus? Is he a son who fills his father's shoes by the end of the epic? Oh, it's when he needs the weapons, the storeroom door open, and it allows Melanthius to get access to the weapons. I'm feeling this. So he saves his father's life. Melanthius is apprehended, isn't he? He's tied up, so he can't carry on arming the suitors. He saves his father's life, and then he meets out a very severe punishment against those slaves who turned against his father. Would you not concede that he does evolve into a much stronger, more assertive man than he was when we first met him?
I suppose the compare
So we're work in progress. Okay, Charlie, what do you mean? What would you say about Telemachus? This is someone who is a son, a worthy son, so to be proud of by the end of the epic. And the maids, orders, the coming of the maids, and this was and is he corrupted by his father? Did he prefer the man as he was at the start, or has he evolved into the man he needs to be his father's son?
Right, I think that's an interesting and complicated question, right? And that, yeah, he does become, because it's inverted commas necessary, very, very violent, in the kind of very violent scene at the end. And there's the moment in book 24 where they're preparing to fight the suitors' families who want to avenge them. And Odysseus says to Telemachus, "Oh, you know, soon you'll have the experience of fighting in battle, the true test of worth. You must not shame your father's family. For years we've been known across the world for courage and manliness." Telemachus inhaled, then said, "Just watch me, father, if you want to see my spirit. I will bring no shame onto your family. You should not speak of shame." Laertes, so we've got again this kind of triad of fathers and sons, thrilled, cried out, "Ah, gods, a happy day for me. My son and grandson are arguing about how tough they are." And so yeah, there's this kind of anxiety about masculinity and about Telemachus' masculinity into adulthood, and that masculinity turns out to be very violent. Yeah, and it's unsettling.
Is it worth saying, Catherine, here, thinking about the Iliad, but there's that famous moment, isn't there, when Hector holds his son up and he says, you know, one day, hopefully someone will say this is a far better man than his father. And that there's that sort of tension of rivalry. Is that coming through, do you think, with Telemachus at this point?
Yeah, this trickiness about the fact that men want their sons to kill as many people and more than they do. That's the paternal aspiration for the son. And in the Iliad scene, it's a fantastic scene in Iliad 6. There's this real tension where Andromache, this little boy's mother, is saying to Hector, her husband, "Don't go back and fight. Don't do the manly thing. Stay behind the walls and be safe, because we all depend on you, and you just can't die, because then we'll all be raped and enslaved." And Hector's like, "Oh, don't worry about that. I really hope my son becomes really murderous." And it's this difficult moment. And yeah, that seems to me to be exactly what's happening here. These questions about paternity and masculinity and violence and yeah, and kind of physical prowess, which is shown by killing other people.
Lucy, Penelope, we once had a question several years ago, but it must have been this century, because it was, is Penelope a good role model for women in the 21st century? What would you say to that?
I can't say in a way that all her actions this I don't think I can be is quite active. Like the woman that wants to help herself and the family.
Yeah, I think that's a very convincing assessment of Penelope. She, like Odysseus, is intensely pragmatic. Right? She knows what needs to happen and she's going to do it. And it is interesting the way in which they're paired. They're both associated with this merit of this kind of cunning quality. She has the trick with the shroud, and she has the trick with the bed. I don't know if you remember the trick with the bed, but the great. But for those who don't know it so well, when she's testing Odysseus to find out who he is, she says, "Oh, I'll just make up a bed for you. You can sleep in the spare room." Basically, someone's moved the bed in there, and he's like, "Hang on, there's something up there. I built the bed myself out of a living olive tree. It can't be moved." And this has this big symbolic function in the Odyssey, where it's the house and it's the bit you return to and it can't be moved and everything moves around it, but there's the house and it's in the same place. And you've got, if you want to go really kind of, we say structuralist when we talk about analyses which deal only really in polar opposites. So you've got the sea, which is changing, and then you've got the land, which is fixed. So there's all of these things going on. But he yeah, and then she tricks him. She tricks her own husband. And so that kind of tricky quality is very much there in Penelope. And yeah, I think she's a big old pragmatist. She's just doing what she needs to do to get by. she keeps her cards very close to her chest.
Would you say, Catherine, that in some ways she's the female mirror of Odysseus? Because as you say, trickery is important. Odysseus is known for tricky. And so are the two really cut from the same cloth, so to speak, male and female of the same cloth?
So there's this definite sense, as I say, that they kind of complement each other. And there's this line somewhere, and I remember this. Someone I know had it. They had a passage from the Odyssey at their wedding, and it's like, oh, the best thing in a marriage is where like a man and a woman are of the same mind, and they, you know, bring joy to their friends and harm to their enemies, which I thought was a bit weird for a wedding, but fine. But yeah, there's this idea that they're kind of the same mind. More often they think in the same way. I suppose the argument I was making earlier is that I think that, and whether this is a character thing or a gender thing, Penelope has to deal with the reality that you can't stop time, and she is able to recognize that in a way that I'm less sure that Odysseus does. So they're not, you know, a male and a female version of the same person, but definitely they have similar qualities. Yeah.
You think that because Odysseus in the legends anyway goes off a wandering again, doesn't he? And there's a very famous poem by Tennyson about that. Would you say that's part of what you're arguing, that going off wandering again is not recognizing that time's past? He's trying to relive his adventures another time, or is that an unfair way of reading that?
Maybe. I mean, the interesting thing about these stories is that they don't really belong to anyone. You can't say, well, the story. You can say, well, this happens in the Odyssey, but then there are all sorts of other, you know, stories about Odysseus, which include the Iliad, right? All these other stories that grow up around this kind of set of tales with different versions, and people pick out the bits that they find are interesting. And you know, that very much continues to today, and in particular, the feminist authors have done kind of feminist workings. So you take the bit that you're interested in, you work with it. But even in the Odyssey, Odysseus explains to Penelope that he's been told that he has to go again on a really long wandering, and he says, I'll only know that I've got there when I see when someone mistakes an oar for a winnowing fan. They've lived so far away from the sea that they don't know what an oar is, and they think it's something for separating kind of chaff and wheat, so wheat and the kind of waste products of wheat. So there's a sense that he's been at sea and now he needs to go really, really far to land, and there is the sense that maybe that he has to keep wandering somehow, and that again, maybe that's also about the Odyssey's kind of anxiety about its own ending. It's what to kind of make space for it.
Just going back to what you were saying earlier about sleep and suffering. One of our students, I can't remember who it was, but criticised Odysseus for forcing the men off the Odyssey land back up. You know, it's just three men. Why not lead them to that life of bliss? But would that life be like a sleep, really, and not being alive? But Odysseus is all about being alive, suffering, that vagrancy of life.
Right. Yeah, I think the Lotus Eater episode is very much part of this theme about sleep and painlessness, but also it's a kind of fantasy. And sure, there's one version in which, yeah, of course they can stay there. But from the point of the story, they can't stay there. You can't sense that. So yeah, I think absolutely that's one of the things.
The spice students were pointing out with the Asbaras episode, he isn't able to control the men. He's a good strategist, and he knows when the best time is to leave the city. But the men disobey him. Whereas in the next episode, he seems to have that firm authority. I suppose it's much harder to control a massive soldiers that are running amok and getting drilled.
Sure, and people are unpredictable and point of view. Yeah.
I think we talk about like the Lotus Eater
Yeah, it's very like the Calypso episode, right? She promises him that he'll never have to suffer. You know, he can be immortal and ageless. But actually, for the sake of the story, he has to go home, which means that he has to suffer.
Odysseus, we've noticed he reacts very intensely to things like with the trials we recently looking at when Eurylochus criticizes him publicly, and Odysseus tells the Phaeacians he's tempted to lop off Eurylochus's head, and we were talking about how he feels things very intensely and reacts very intensely.
But this is also very much what Andy was saying about honor. This real importance of honor, and if you're insulted by an inferior publicly, you're gonna, you know, absolutely, you know, go be super angry. That's something that really matters to this, his honor, and really matters in general to people in the ancient world.
And would you say that, at least in our culture here in this country, honor isn't such a big deal, but it is in some other cultures?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's really interesting. There are lots of cultures where honor is really important, you know, including cultures today, you know, this also, it becomes this question in some cases of kind of masculine honor, and not being insulted and being able to kind of defend your honor, often with violence. And then it takes on a kind of sexual component with women. There's a kind of sexual honor of women, and in order to defend your own honor, you have to be able to kind of defend and avenge the perceived sexual honor of your women, and that's definitely something that is very much the case in most ancient Greek cultures. And definitely in lots of cultures today.
I think it's fair to say, well, then I was an undergraduate anyway, we were told that there's a distinction to be made between shame cultures, where the bad thing is being made to look bad, and guilt cultures where the bad thing was you feeling bad internally yourself. And some people would argue that both the Homeric poems actually are on the cusp of potentially a change from a culture which is primarily a shame culture, where one with a bit more guilt culture is sort of coming in from the side. But there are hard moments like that one where the shame culture is clearly on the top. And interestingly, I think I would say the most moving part of the Iliad for me is actually Hector and Andromache in Book 6. And there, I think, again, there's an interesting tension, because we have Hector sort of realizing he's the guardian, but he says, no, I'm going to have to fight, because if I don't, I will look bad in front of the Trojan ladies with their trailing dresses. And the shame culture comes back with a big whap at that point. Again, Catherine is much more on the ball, much, as you can see, much younger for a start, so more up to date. So maybe that doesn't work anymore. But as I say, I was always told that there are shame cultures and guilt cultures, not obviously pure ones, but where those ideas are more prevalent than others, shall we say. I guess nowadays we tend to live, or like to think we do, in a guilt culture. But I also think, and those of us who are male in this room would possibly agree with me or not, that actually for a lot of blokes, the shame culture is still there in spades from time to time.
What do you think about the continuing the last chapter doesn't fit with the rest of it, and it should end where again at the last chapter in this first one?
Sure. So I was implicitly, I think, saying in my talk that I think that last chapter does do really important stuff. So the episode in the underworld where Agamemnon talks about Penelope and compared to Clytemnestra is very much, again, this idea about kind of women's honor and the stories that are told about women. And he says, oh, you know, Penelope, people will sing nice songs about her. And so that is very much the theme of the poem, kind of women and their reputations, comparing women, and this idea of songs being sung about people. The paternity theme and the land theme are really important at 24. And I think, as I said, I think we want it to end in 23 because we're like, the husband and wife, they get back together again. But actually there are other really important things that need to happen. He needs to reclaim his land, he needs to reclaim his paternal line. And they need to have this conversation about how the story will be told and remembered afterwards. So I think book 24 is really important. But I think it's really interesting that lots of people, lots of very eminent people and all sorts of people just reading the poem. It's like, hang on, this book doesn't really fit. And I think that is interesting. And I think, well, when we get a passage of the Odyssey or the Iliad and we think this doesn't fit, I think we have to think about why we want it to fit, and whether there's a case for it actually fitting. And yeah, so I suppose I'm very much in the view that 24 belongs exactly where it does, and it's an appropriate ending to the Odyssey. But I completely see with you that to us a much more natural ending would be the end of it. Yeah.
Why do you think Cyclops didn't go even further to write sort of like the story that we don't see with him going in line?
Sure, that's a very fair question. I think because the story does have to end somewhere, right? And I think this is a good ending, right? And I'm kind of beginning to repeat myself now, which may mean that I'm not answering your question. So you should stop me if I'm not. But he has to get back his wife. He has to get back his land. He has to get back his paternal line. He's got all of those. Now the story connects. Oh, and also he's dealt with the problems of the suitors in a semi-unsatisfactory way, right? There's this conflict that's burgeoning from the suitors' families who want to avenge it, and the gods are like, oh, we'll fix that. Sometimes that seems a bit hasty. But I think, a poem cannot tell everything. And within the Iliad, we see this in particular. The Iliad doesn't do the Trojan horse story. It doesn't do the Achilles, the Patroclus, the Paris hitting Achilles in the heel thing. There are bits of this story that this particular poem can't tell. And we think there are all these kind of stories floating around, and each poet is like, right, I'm going to tell this bit. And you've got to start somewhere and you've got to end somewhere. But yeah, you could have gone on.
Now then, talking of endings, I think we've got perhaps one last question, but then it's a long way to Oxford. I don't think we want Katherine to walk, do we? So, but please do fire away.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. Yeah.
It's really handy because we have a lot of students who went to university, a lot of people who love history and ancient history as well as classics. What are the key things that you're looking for in applications?
So I should say that I'm in a delicate position here, right? Because I do admissions. But what I would say is we're really looking for you to show us that you're really interested in this subject. And the way you show us that is by showing us that you've done some thinking and some reading in your own terms. You haven't just read the stuff that you've done in class. You've thought about the things that you're interested in that have come up in class. And then you've been like, right, actually, I'm going to go and research that myself. So when you get to university, it's a lot more, you do a lot more independent research. You learn to become a researcher. And you do it kind of on your own. There's a lot of guidance that's provided to you, but you do become more independent. And to show us that you'll be able to do that, so you have to show us that you've kind of gone away and you thought, you know what, I was really interested in, I don't know, shame and honor in the Odyssey, or and so I went away and I read this, or I'm really interested in Roman architecture, so I went away and I read this and I thought about this. So the demonstration that you're able to kind of follow your own interests and to demonstrate that commitment. And then the ability to think about things and to change and develop your ideas when you get more information, which again is something you could show us in an interview, if the university you're applying to does interviews, or just in a personal statement where you say, I used to think this and then I read this and then I thought differently about it. So I would, yeah, I think those two things. I think I think some people can overemphasize things like extracurricular activities in like a personal statement, for example. We want to know, sure, we want to know that you're an all-rounded person, but actually we're most interested in you as a thinker, you as someone who's interested in your subject and thinking about it. So please, definitely that's the thing that we're really interested in. So on the same note, don't pick a subject that you think is, oh, that's a good subject to do at university, but you don't really care about it, or that's something that it's easy to get into, but you don't really care about it. Pick something that you're going to be studying this for like 3 years, maybe 4. Pick something that you really care about and show us that you care about it. I think that would be my.
Yeah, I do admissions at Manchester, and I'd agree with all of that, particularly the last bit. Don't do something you think, oh, I did that at school, so it'll be easy, because the great joy of it, I've probably worked out by now, I'm a very argumentative person. I used to argue with my teachers at school all the time, and the joy I found was the bits of ancient history that I thought were awkward and problematic, and my teacher told me, no, they're not. When I got to university, I discovered they were awkward and problematic.
Yeah.
So when you read, always be prepared. When I open a new book, my first thought is, how am I going to disagree with this author? Yeah. I read aggressively, critically. Sometimes I'm convinced by their arguments, but it's for the author to convince me, not for me simply to absorb it like a sponge. And if you show people again that you're prepared to argue around the theme, you know it well enough that you have your own opinion, that will go down very well. But now I think we really must draw to a close. So what I'd like to do is first of all thank Katherine, for which I think it's been a very splendid session. I'd also like to thank Sixth Form College for hosting the Classical Association this afternoon. And I would also like to thank the members of the Sixth Form College for contributing and making this such a lively session. So I ask you to thank Katherine in the traditional way, but you're thanking yourselves at the same time.